c'est pas une punition, justement. Ça permet d'avoir une interaction un peu plus rapprochée avec le public. Il y a des places devant. Vous voyez tout devant. Les derniers en classe, voilà, tout devant. Right. I think we'll give it a start. Can everybody actually hear me without me shouting into the mic? No? I do need it. Okay. It's very imposing, this microphone. Right. Can everybody hear me now? Shout if you can't. Haha. So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out in the rain and at this late hour on a Tuesday evening. Thank you for the Geneva Peacebuilding platform for actually enabling this event to take place. And thank you also to the WMO for hosting us. I think we're the only event that's sort of outside of the outside of the Palais and the Maison de la Paix. And also thank you very much for Geneva Water Hub for co-hosting and co-facilitating this event. So growing out of our interest in natural resource and conflict, sorry, I'm going to restart my phrase by presenting myself first of all, sorry. So I'm from the Quaker United Nations office. My name's Florence Foster, and I'm here on the panel with a quite diverse range of actors to talk about natural resource management and conflict. We have here Mara from the Mara Tignino from the Geneva Water Hub, who is also a tutor at the University of Geneva. We also have Julius Jackson here with us, working for the FAO. We have Murray Burt, who's a senior WASH officer with UNHCR. We have also Nora Maier, who is a consultant with the FAO currently, and also used to be with us at CUNO. We also have Michael Talami from the ICRC, who's an urban advisor. So quite a range of actors here on the panel today. So growing out of our interests in natural resource conflict and cooperation, we naturally turned to the University of Geneva, who hosts the Geneva Water Hub, to co-host this event on conflicts on water, land, and food, looking at prevention and responses. So while water, land, and other key natural resources shape billion people's lives, livelihood, food security, well-being, and identity, their equitable management has increasingly become problematic. Especially with a multitude of factors that have been increasingly impeding on it, including resource degradation, climate change, population growth, and violent conflict that exacerbate vulnerabilities. So, faced with all these challenges, we wanted to respond from a diverse range of views, both from sort of humanitarian development and peace building, as well as a human rights perspective. So to this end, we've invited all these practitioners to respond to a few of our questions. Now, due to the time limitations, we've put up 2 sets of questions. Each will be followed with a Q&A, so I invite you to get your questions ready in advance, raise your hand, and don't be scared to ask any of the questions. I think our panelists are eager to actually have a conversation with you. So please, let's make it as interactive as possible. I will be the timekeeper, so I will also stop our panelists after about 5 minutes each. So in advance, if they haven't finished some of the elements that they might have wanted to share with you, again, the Q&A is the opportunity to actually continue that dialogue. Bearing in mind that all of them, well, half of them are Geneva-based and the rest are in Europe, please do reach out to them if you have further questions afterwards. It's not sort of one-off call for dialogue. So the first question that I will bring to the panel will be perhaps to kick off the discussion looking at the challenges that each of the panelists will seize in their daily work. So from their very particular perspective on a personal level, how do they see the challenges in resource management and how it plays out in the conflict cycle? So perhaps we will start with Mara and see how.
So thank you, Florence. I should say that it was a pleasure to organize together this event, and I'm grateful to her really to we thought together to the how to organize what are the topics included in this session. So for the first element that I would like to underline related to the topic of our conference, it is the linkages between natural resources, particular water and land, and also, of course, food. And when we look at the water conflicts, the most part of the cases always we can say always it's not only a conflict on water, it is a conflict on land, on other natural resources, and of course it also involves a question of access to food. So my first point, it is the multidimensional aspect of conflicts on natural resources. And so I would like to mention an example. Of course, you can have many other examples in mind, but we can have the illustration of land grabbing, so the appropriation of land, in particular in Africa, for example, I think to the case of Ethiopia. So in relation to this, I think it is very important to underline this aspect of the involvement of local community. So local community are the first that have an impact on when there are these conflicts on natural resources. So I think that the involvement of local population can also be a way for the prevention of conflict. And my second short point, it is related to the use of water as a weapon. So we are in a session also dealing with emergency situations. So you have in mind, of course, the examples of the use of water, of dams on the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And so in this context, I would like to bring the legal perspective, of course, the norms of international humanitarian law, the principles, general principles of international humanitarian law, like the principle of distinction, of proportionality, the humanity principles, so the humanitarian considerations that have, of course, a particular importance in the case of to ensure access to water. So I answer, and I try to set a general context, and maybe later we can have a discussion on this point.
Thank you very much, Mara, with 1 minute to spare. Good. I'll pass on the microphone to my neighbour, Murray, who will speak more to the challenges perhaps that UNHCR faces.
Okay. Well, thank you, and good evening, everyone. My name is Murray Burt. I'm the head of water and sanitation at the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. Refugees and forced displacement is a global challenge. And I'm just back from a mission to Bangladesh, where I've seen more than 600,000 Rohingya refugees crossing the border from Myanmar. And if we look globally, there's more than 66 million people displaced by war and persecution worldwide. And the average protracted refugee situation now is exceeding 26 years, and there's many refugee situations which are much longer. And as we look at the reasons for forced displacement, it's normally conflict, sometimes isolated persecution. And as we drill down into the issues behind conflict, it's normally political. And if you go the next layer down, it's normally to do with resource competition. and access to resources which drive conflicts. And as a result of these types of conflicts, it's innocent individuals get caught up in the crossfire and then are being forcibly displaced and having to cross international borders or moving within their country and becoming IDPs, internally displaced people. And these are the persons of concern to the High Commissioner for Refugees. As we overlay the concept of climate change and changes that we're seeing across the world with temperatures rising, increased flooding in some areas, droughts in others, we see how this can also start to become a driver of conflict and can also be driving displacement. And we've seen people moving cross borders due to food insecurity that's as a result of conflict, but also to do with increased droughts and reduced rainfalls in certain areas. So I'm thinking of South Sudan and Somalia in recent years and even ongoing now. But as refugees cross the border or move into another area, there results in another type of conflict and another type of resource competition as communities who are hosting refugees start to feel threatened by those refugees who have come into their community. And you've seen this even in Europe with the 2015 influx of Syrian refugees into Europe and how this has become high on the political agenda for many countries, even in Europe. But what I've seen in a country like Bangladesh just recently, maybe a resource poor area where you have 600,000 new people arrive, there's definitely resource competition. Prices are increasing for commodities on the market. There's competition for food, there's competition for cooking fuel, there's deforestation which happens, there's need for building materials to construct houses, and often it's forests and natural resources that are covering some of the cost. And this in turn can create a secondary competition and conflict between hosting communities and refugees. And one word that UNHCR uses is encouraging peaceful coexistence between host communities and refugees. And I'll look into that a little more in the next round. But some of the drivers that can create this conflict is where there's service level inequality. So sometimes refugees can get services for free because the humanitarian community, the international community says, oh, these people are vulnerable, they should receive water for free or cooking fuel for free, whereas the host community is having to pay for these same resources. So that can create some sort of conflict. And in these situations, maybe refugees are seen as being better off than the hosting community. And in some contexts, say for instance in Kenya, northern Kenya and Kakuma camp, this may in fact be the case. But in other contexts, refugees are a lot worse off than the hosting community, and there's resource inequality and conflict as a result of that. Also, we see inequality in access to basic services, so whether it's water supply, sanitation, access to the job and labor market. And these types of inequalities between refugees and hosting communities also create a secondary conflict. So those are a lot of the challenges that face us, and I think in the next round of questions we'll be looking at more of the solutions. So back to you.
Thank you very much. Again, excellent timekeeping, I'm liking this. I think next we'll have Julius Jackson from the... I always hope that I project far enough, but that's not the case. So we'll have Julius Jackson next from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Flo. Okay, can you hear me? Yes, Echo. Do well. Okay. So I'm based in Rome, working with the Food and Agricultural Organization. I work under the strategic program on resilience, and I have a particular area of interest around protracted crises and conflict, and specifically looking at FAO's work in, through, and on conflict. So very, very happy to be here this evening to share some insights. I'm going to maybe take a slightly different tack for my answer here and be a little bit more high level. And I want to flag 2 or 3 challenges that I've come across as I've been working in the organization. Conflict prevention and conflict-sensitive programming. And I think one of the first ones is, it's often mentioned, but the real need to acknowledge complexity. And it's not a get-out-of-jail card, nor is it, running the risk of going down a rabbit hole and never coming out. But the relationship between natural resources and violent conflict is complex, and as has already been alluded to, very political, and depends on the specific context that it's in, and can play out at very, very different levels simultaneously. And moreover, there's a cycle here as well, where the interlinked nature can be part of that kind of a cycle where violent conflict can have a fundamental impact on natural resources and can undermine systems of environmental governance, be it on land tenure, be it on customary tenure approaches, etc. And at the same time, competition over natural resources can also be a potential trigger for conflict. And just to give you a little example on what I mean about making sure we're acknowledging the complexity, as you all know, the UN Secretary General has made it very clear that conflict prevention is at the heart of the reform and his tenure. But when I look at, for example, the recent UNSG report on Boko Haram and the Lake Chad Basin, it doesn't acknowledge the underlying environmental dynamics that significantly affect the water security and the food security of local communities in the region. So there's obviously something missing. So we're not getting the complexity right, I think. Now, linked to that is a second point, and that's the risk I found about oversimplification of issues. And this is particularly when talking with policymakers in various sectors. There is a desire to see causal links, which may simply not be there. And I can think of three, for example, youth and radicalization. Not everybody who's young is going to be an extremist. Climate change and conflict. There is not a causal link. It is far more complex and nuanced than that. And the fact that if you support rural livelihoods, you're going to reduce migration flows. Now, there are elements of truth in all of those, but there is a risk that if we're looking at designing policies and actions, and that they are being funded by donors, if they're not taking a wider angle lens and a broader view, that we're actually getting some of those interventions wrong, and we're missing a trick. And I think the third point I'll make, and I can see I've got about a minute left, is around changing mindsets and perceptions as one of the key challenges. I work for a specialized agency, a technical agency within the UN system. And partly due to mandates, and partly due to the fact that we have technical specialists in a number of different sectors, there is a tendency to look at problems as a technical solution, but not look at the political aspects, the political economy aspects, particularly around natural resources, which you really need to be able to frame a coherent, transformative, deliberate approach, and to make sure that your programming and that your policies are going to be addressing some of the underlying drivers and root causes. And I think we also then have to be careful about, well, what are the objectives of an organization like FAO? Our mandate is around reducing rural poverty, sustainable agriculture, food security. We don't want to lose sight of that, but we do need to make sure we understand what some of the other ramifications are of the work that we do. And that changing mindsets and perceptions and leading people to understand what impacts they can have beyond the immediate technical is something which I'll get to a little bit in, I think, the second part, talking to some of the practical experiences that we've had. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll hand over to Michael from the ICRC, who will continue the discussion.
Thank you and good evening. I'm Michael Telhemi, the Urban Advisor in the Water and Habitat Unit. Can you hear me? The Middle East, but also urban contexts in parts of Africa, Ukraine, and Afghanistan. I'll try to complement a little bit what's been said already, developing a little bit on the levels of complexity that Julien mentioned, as well as talking about the other side of the coin from what Murray had discussed refugees. I'll discuss a little bit more within conflict zones in terms of IDPs and the host communities or the resident community there. From decades of field experience, the ICRC over the years has witnessed natural resources have at times directly contributed to fueling conflicts, and often suffer directly from the consequence of conflicts. For instance, pollution of water resources or the direct destruction of infrastructure, as Mara had alluded to previously. More often than being a direct source, however, of conflict, water plays a more indirect role, whereby water-related issues form part of a complex set of variables that can ultimately lead to civil unrest or exacerbate existing tensions or grievances within a conflict area. A good example of this is the so-called Arab Spring, where inequitable access to a sufficient quantity and quality of water at an affordable price became one of several grievances that led people to take to the streets. On the other side, you do see more localized social conflicts over access to water-related issues, but this is where water stress is amongst the greatest. Examples of that are far and few between, but I can think of places in Yemen outside of Taiz where for decades there has been tribal feuds over water. In this regard, it is worth recognizing that inequitable distribution of water resources, inadequate service provision, and poor water resource management often predate the onset of conflict. Populations, therefore, are affected by such destabilizing events are further obliged to suffer from the cumulative effects of water scarcity as well as conflict. In such instances of armed conflict, it is necessary to not only address the humanitarian consequences, but also the root causes. And this really goes back to what Mara had mentioned earlier. The root causes are addressed through protection in the case of resources, as well as the delivery systems, the infrastructure that deliver those natural resources, in this case, water. Those objects are protected in terms of international humanitarian law. So for the ICRC, we try to address this through a bilateral confidential dialogue with the parties to the conflict to either prevent further destruction of natural resources or infrastructure, or to mitigate the effects through our protection action in terms of changing the conduct of hostilities of the warring parties. Whereas the humanitarian consequences are dealt through more of an operational response, which is typically probably what you're used to seeing from UN agencies to NGOs to the ICRC. In specific relation to assistance, unaddressed issues around equitable access to water, inclusiveness of vulnerable groups, but all groups, as well as affordability are all prominent challenges that are at risk of being further exacerbated during times of conflict. What is at risk, if they are not, is the deterioration of public health, the inability to sustain livelihoods, and mass or potential mass displacement. In turn, both prevention and responses in terms of mitigating humanitarian consequences play a crucial role in helping to create a more conducive environment for conflict resolution and moving towards peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll pass it on to Nora, who will be speaking to us, I guess, from an external point of view as a consultant for the FAO, but also previous work with us at CUNO. Thank you.
My name is Nora Maier, and I work on a joint research project for CUNO and FAO on the role of farmer seed systems in sustaining peace, with a focus on social cohesion as a pathway to positive local collective action. And maybe I will build on to what Julius has said previously, sort of about this danger of natural resource and violent conflict becoming sort of part of a vicious cycle in a way, and the way conflict or violent conflict can impact the effectiveness of environmental governance. Destructive conflict impacts social relationships as well as the relationships between state and society. It can create lower levels of societal and public trust and can undermine the effectiveness of social and economic networks and governance arrangements and the ability and willingness of individuals to cooperate. It is such governance arrangements, customary or formal, which determine the basis on which groups interact over the management of control over natural resources. Once destroyed, these structures are very hard to rebuild. And this is particularly dangerous considering that natural resources, such as fresh water, cropland, rangeland, are vital for the livelihoods of many communities worldwide. These communities are dependent on equitable governance systems, including equal access to and distribution of natural resources. Consequently, if environmental governance systems are undermined or destroyed as a result of the impact of conflict on social cohesion, their livelihoods may be negatively affected and threatened. And such impacts can be compounded when coupled with natural hazards, possibly leading to protracted crises and continued fragility. Considering that an increasing amount of conflicts are fought around natural resources, as well as at the local level, it is important for us to better understand the interrelation between social cohesion and violent conflict, and how best to capitalize on existing well-functioning governance arrangements and networks. Creating the space for and facilitating dialogue in ways that rebuild the bonds of trust, confidence, and cooperation between affected parties are core peacebuilding governance activities. And I will speak more to the actual research that we're doing in the second question.
Thank you very much. Not getting used to these mics. Thank you very much for all the panelists, and also thank you very much for keeping to the time. That's very much appreciated. Now we've heard a variety of views and challenges from across the sector, and I'd like to open the floor for some questions, comments. Please keep them relatively short so that everybody gets the time to speak. If you want to address a particular question to one of the panelists, please explicitly do so. Otherwise, I will let it free fall for the panelists to answer whichever question they feel most comfortably answering. So the floor is yours. I'm unsure if there's a mic going around or if you have to project. There is a mic. Yeah. Our director is taking the floor. Oh no. Excellent. Anybody comments or questions? Oh, so we've got a gentleman in the front and Erin in the back. Oh, and please identify yourself. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I'm Mr. Berluti. I'm Senior Research Fellow within Recherche et Documentation Juridique Africaine. We are Brussels-based, a group of African lawyers dealing with African regulation and legislation on various aspects of law. But I'm involved in peace building and conflict prevention in addition to economic issues. I don't have a question, but just a comment on the presentation about the management of land and water. Most of the time we face just a problem of communication between authorities and people, because we have in some country local government, even national government, who are signing or signing agreements on regional area. So that we call normally the regional agreements for economic aspects or for cultural aspects. But they don't communicate to the own population that now we have an agreement with this country, this country with our neighbor, so that not be surprised to see people from the neighbor country coming, doing to some activity in our country, because we also can extend our activity in the country, because now we have an agreement. So when the population will see the people coming from the south country or a neighboring country come try to invest or fishing activity, and so they don't have any information, so it creates a source of conflict between people. Most of the time it's a problem of communication between authorities and the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Got a question in the back.
Thank you. Great presentations. My name's Erin McCandless from the New School, and I've also done a bit of work with different UN agencies. And one of the pieces of work I did was with PBSO and PBF on peace dividends, contributions of administrative and social services to peace building, and we outlined 3 theories of change. And so I'm curious, and at the time, there wasn't enough evidence really, because there wasn't enough evaluation that was explicitly tailored to particular designs. So I'm curious about the status of that. You know, how is intentional design theories of change around this type of work, both having a direct or indirect impact on peace building through the different kinds of natural resource-based programming projects that you're working on? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll take a few more. Lady in the front.
Thank you. I'm Valerie Sumov from Prana Sustainable Water, and my question goes to Mr. Jackson. Do you use artificial intelligence to link and to check the interdependencies between all those factors, or do you just say, okay, this is a complex situation? Because I believe that with some points you can solve other points, but via this artificial intelligence you can know the impacts before acting.
Thank you. My name is Alana Dumitru. I'm from the Permanent Mission of Romania here in Geneva. Thank you very much for all the presentation, and I want to know if this dialogue and changing the mentality of the people and the dialogue between the local authorities, local communities, and civil society could be pushed or underlined through some guidelines or public platform for exchange of views or best practices or so on. Thank you.
I'm Kaduri. I'm the ambassador of Nigeria in Geneva. Thank you for convening this very interesting workshop. My worry is the title. The title seems to imply that where we have water, natural resources, it leads to conflicts because you have competitions between possible users. But I can give you a practical example of what we've gone through in our own region, where the Lake Chad Basin, which has 4 neighboring countries, Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. It has, to us, become a source of unity and development. It was established in, I think, 1964. You can imagine how many years it is. Unlike what happened, or what is happening now with respect to the Nile River, where we have a lot of tensions. We had, I don't know whether we had or we still have tensions on the use of the Nile. For us, the Lake Chad itself serves as a source of unity. in terms of agriculture, water, and the other hydrological uses. To the extent that countries that don't share borders with the lake, because of the successes they've seen between these 4 countries, have joined. So you find countries like the Central African Republic have joined the Chad. We have 8 countries from 4. Even Egypt, Libya, and so on. And the DRC and Congo, can you imagine? At the moment, because the Chad, the lake itself has shrunk by 90%. It only has 10% of its original capacity. Now, because of the cooperation between the states, it's agreed now to redirect water from the Obangi River in the Congo Valley to Lake Chad. So that is an example of where a natural resource could be a source of unity and development. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. You've preempted our second part of spoiler. We had a question from the front, I believe.
Thank you for your presentations. My name is Jean-David Fay, University of Geneva, Water Sciences. My question is quite simple. Mr. Jackson already talked about the political aspect of my question. Probably there is other parameters, but I would like to know if increasing food security in a place is enough to decrease refugees' flow.
Sorry. Anybody else? Otherwise, I'll open to the panelists to answer. There is a second round, so it's not all lost. Okay. Right. So I think I'll open to the panelists, and there are a few direct questions to Julius. So I'll let you tackle those, and then open to the rest if anybody wants to address them as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Florence, and thank you for those excellent questions. First, maybe just address the point raised by Erin around evidence and theories of change. I mean, this is absolutely central, and it's actually something I was going to be mentioning in the second part, in terms of how we can maybe better move ahead in terms of design of programs. I do think there is a real issue with there being a lot of rhetoric and a lot of received wisdom around pathways, and a lack of empirical evidence supporting those interactions or relationships. It's something which personally I'm very mindful of, and we're working with Uppsala, with PRIO, with others to put in place some research through M&E in programs around resilience where conflict is existing, to see if there is anything that we can uncover there. So I think you're absolutely right, because otherwise again, it's part of that oversimplification problem. But the issue is, there really is very little evidence out there. And when you talk to academics, to colleagues in Uppsala and elsewhere, they know this, and it's something which I think there's been an uptick in interest to make sure that we're actually starting to look at that. And it's how we better design our monitoring and evaluation. It's how we better design our evidence building, and indeed evaluations. And I think sometimes there's too much tick boxing going on, frankly, and a lot of saying, well, if that's the pathway we're saying that we've addressed and it's built social cohesion is notoriously difficult to actually measure. I'm not entirely sure that we have an agreed methodological approach to measuring social cohesion, which would be accepted across programs. So very valid, and a lot more work to do there. The specific question around like artificial intelligence, or a systems approach to understanding the interconnectedness and nodes between natural resources, food security, rural livelihoods, and so forth. Well, that is part of a food systems approach, and it's part of a livelihood systems approach to understand how each different sector can impinge upon specific outcomes, be it sustainable livelihoods, be it resilience, be it food security, nutrition. Taking an AI perspective on that, no, I'm not aware that this is something specifically we do. In terms of that kind of computational approach, I think we're a lot more 20th century, 19th century maybe than we are 21st century on that. The point raised by the lady from Romania around dialogue, local communities and civil society organizations, and whether there are guidelines and approaches and methodologies out there. speaking from tools that we use in FAO around, for example, land tenure, participatory negotiated territorial development is exactly that kind of an approach, which seeks to bring stakeholders around the table, communities, other actors within the power dynamics that are around the particular natural resource in question, to come up with an agreed shared plan to how to approach a more equitable and fairer access, use, management of natural resources. And there are plenty of other examples, I think, across different agencies, different NGOs, different actors, and local communities themselves, having their own structures and systems in place to manage natural resource conflict, which we then need to be very mindful of when designing and working with them about what will actually bring the best outcome. And then the specific question from the gentleman from the University of Geneva, is increasing food security enough to decrease flows in refugees or migrants? In and of itself, no. I do think we need to be very much more nuanced in understanding all of the complexities of drivers that force people or make people have a decision to move somewhere. In certain cases, this is due to human rights abuses, persecution, conflict, fear of life. But there are other factors going on, and we can think about the potential impact of climate change on an already economically marginalized community who is heavily dependent on agriculture, but has been neglected by the state with support around, for example, extension services. There's a tipping point, and you don't necessarily know what that tipping point might be. That's not to say that food security is not important. It is. I mean, as it's been said, a hungry man is an angry man. But it's part of a much wider set of issues that need to be explored. And maybe by improving food security, not just through food assistance, but by supporting sustainable rural livelihoods, access to employment, services, political engagement, etc., you will then maybe go some way to having a different dynamic and metric for people to take decisions about whether they move or not. And I would just say, you know, coming from an organization which deals with farmers, most of the time, and depending on their tenure relationship, but most of the time farmers do not want to leave their land. It's the very last thing they want to do. That is their productive asset. Same with pastoralists. They do not want to lose their livestock. That is their productive asset. Without that, they do not have a livelihood. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think I'll pass it straight on to Murray, who'll answer some of the displacement-related questions.
Maybe just to add on to what Julius has said about the food security-related forced displacement and refugees, I 100% agree with what he said. Is always these decisions are complex and related to a whole range of factors. And exactly what Julius said, most people don't want to leave their home. And you just imagine yourself, what is it that would force you to leave your country? And it takes a lot of pressures to build up, and normally it's related to conflict and persecution. But the issue of food security has been the tipping point in a number of examples. And I referred to the Somalia famine in 2011, where there was a significant number of people who found that food insecurity was that final tipping point. But it was related to a much more complex situation, where there was conflict, and the conflict itself had led to inability to plant. This was overlain with climatic conditions and drought, and all of these things culminated to be that final tipping point. But you can't isolate that in every refugee situation, and sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. I've also seen examples where people have left, say for example, DRC refugees coming into Uganda, have left because they felt the insecurity in DRC, but they're so attached to their land that they're often going back during the day to farm their land, and then coming at night to sleep in Uganda because they're feeling safer in that environment. So yeah, definitely there's situations where food insecurity can be the tipping point, but I don't think that solving food insecurity is going to resolve all refugee crisis around the world.
And seeing as I'm the moderator, I'll use my powers just to jump on that displacement access aspect. Mixed migration is something that's been sort of on everybody's mind, sort of apart from the definition aspect of who you have in front of you. So there's an increasing amount of research that's going into what pushes people to leave so that you can address the root causes and prevent people from leaving in the first place, because the situations they get into are not necessarily better than what they're leaving, and how to then avoid them. So where's the tipping point? What makes people leave? And not looking at necessarily at a one size fits all approach. You know, so Save the Children is looking at what makes children leave, what makes youth leave, because there'll be very different reasons why somebody might leave if they're in their mid-30s or if they're in their 60s. So just to say that there's a lack of research existing, but there's more and more interest in it to understand and to prevent migration flows from happening in the first place. Okay.
Just to add a point of clarification for those of you from a more legal perspective, in the realm of international law, I think you have to be aware that there's a special category for refugee under the 1951 Convention, and this is a person who's forced across an international border as a result of conflict, persecution, due to their race, religion, political affiliation, sexual orientation. So there's a specific category within international law which will be and is defined as refugee, which is different from someone who may be an economic migrant and moving for other reasons than conflict and persecution. So just to make that clarification.
I think Mara wants to jump in. Do you also want to talk to some of the questions? So Mara first?
Yeah, I heard about law, international law, so I feel that I should say something. Yeah, of course, as Mari said, in the 51 Geneva Convention, there is not reference to the environment. But just I have in mind that yesterday the Conference of the Parties of the Climate Change Convention has started. And it's very interesting that in the last years the issue of migrations was brought, in particular from the International Organization for Migration. We have also the beginning of a definition of what does it mean environmental migrants. But of course, I think that there is a lot of work to do, and a lot of also topics for research that can be done in this field.
It's not getting any less complex. We seem to be going into various subjects. Briefly, do you have any? The second half? Okay. So I think we'll go straight on to the next question, which, as our colleague from Nigeria, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much, mentioned the transformative elements of natural resource management, that it's not de facto an outcome to get to conflict or destructive conflict or war, but that there is a transformative element to natural resource management. I'll get that almost right. Both in sort of not artificially, but created platforms like you mentioned on Lake Chad, which is a very good one, but also quite naturally in social systems that already exist. So I think our panelists will talk to some of those transformative elements that they've been able to witness. I'll start with Mara again.
Yeah, when I was preparing this, trying to prepare the questions, the answers to these questions, I thought about the case of the Convention on the Protection and Use of International Water Courses and transboundary lakes. And here it is very interesting because this convention was really the result of of bringing together Eastern and the European and the Western European countries. So water, shared water resources became a tool for bringing together this the Eastern and the Western Europe. It was just at the end of the Cold War. This convention was adopted in 1992. So I think it is a very good example that comes from Europe. No, when we think about conflicts, it's not the first place Europe that we think about. And also in the framework of this convention, in particular of the conference of the parties of this convention, it is interesting that this instrument was a source of inspiration for other agreements. In particular, in the Balkanic region, we have an instrument on the Sava River basin, so the most important affluent of the Danube River, that brings together Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Croatia. So it brings together these countries that were just after an armed conflict. So I think we should also reflect upon not only the other regions, but also Europe can give can have conflicts on natural resources, on water. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll mix it up again this time, and I'll have Nora take the floor, speaking more to her research.
So the communal management of natural resources, in particular at the local level, may serve as the basis for rebuilding key relationships and trust, thereby promoting governance and peace building. Cooperative planning and managing of shared natural resources can provide a platform for dialogue by fostering communication and interaction between stakeholders and communities, transforming insecurities and establishing mutually recognized rights and expectations. Over time, improving cooperation over natural resources may then lead to cooperation in other areas by establishing a basis of trust for continued joint of action. To speak a bit more to the research, as I said before, it was on the role of farmer seed systems in sustaining peace, and the underlying premise was that farmer seed systems were themselves a form of positive local collective action, leading to increased trust and increased cooperation. And I'll give you a little bit of background as to what farmer seed systems are and why we chose to research them for this project. Farmer seed systems have been defined as social networks that emerge with the formation of ties by seed transfer events. Farmers obtain up to 90% of their seed from sources within farmer seed systems. Such seed are produced, reused, and stored on farm and at community level and in their natural habitat by farmers from their own harvest, through exchange and barter among friends, neighbors, and relatives, and through local grain markets. To just name a few possibilities, they can take a variety of forms and shapes. For all of them, the circulation of seed is a social process, though, so which is based on trust, possibly mutual, and is influenced by sociocultural norms and practices. Farmer seed systems are important for the socio-ecological resilience of our global food system, as well as the ability of local rural communities to building resilience to conflict. In terms of socio-ecological resilience, the majority of agricultural biodiversity is actively maintained through farmer seed systems. This diversity is what enables our global food system to adapt and respond to environmental and other changes. Small-scale farmers in developing countries depend on this agricultural biodiversity to maintain sustainable production and meet their livelihood needs. The current erosion of agricultural biodiversity diminishes their capacity to cope with such changes and leads to yield instability and loss, and can increase their vulnerability to becoming food insecure. Another important aspect to consider is that farmer seed systems provide access to seed and can therefore play an important role in fulfilling local and national seed requirements and eventually in achieving food and nutrition security. In particular, the storage of seed at communal level may in that regard provide important safety nets and serve as coping mechanisms in times of conflict. Collective action that underlies this farmer seed system is based on social cooperation. Interaction between groups to address mutual problems such as the management of natural resources is often a good starting point for building trust and establishing cooperation. For instance, we have found that trust among farmers can increase cooperation, lower transaction costs, increase bargaining power within the market, and allow groups of individuals to share the risk associated with experimentation and adoption of new innovations. On the other hand, we also found a case of community-level seed production in which a lack of social cohesion was a constraint to collective action, in that a lack of trust among people led to reduced willingness to cooperate among parties and ultimately led to a decrease in food production. And this finding, the potential contribution of peacebuilding to the effectiveness of some of these local systems that support resilience as well as post-conflict recovery and development should therefore be further explored. And just to sum it up, community-based management of natural resources plays a vital role in restoring collaboration at the local level and therefore in overall local peace building and prevention efforts. This is important as an increasing number of conflicts are fought around natural resources as well as at the local level. Enhancing relationships at community level can increase both the community's resilience to future shocks, as well as promoting social cohesion by providing inclusive and participatory frameworks of collaboration. The thereby established levels of trust and relationships can then lead to future collective action in other areas.
Thank you very much, Nora. So two very different aspects of how transformative natural resource management can be. I'll pass it on to Michael to have another diametrically different aspect.
Step back in terms of armed conflicts. If we look at what are some of the most pressing issues around armed conflicts and natural resource management and service provision today, we primarily see that challenge in being able to stabilize and ensure some level of access to urban services, be it water, wastewater, electricity, and the interconnectedness then between those various services, so those dependencies that exist there. This is a challenge for humanitarian actors who have basically developed their traditional humanitarian responses to be responsive to either short-term emergencies or to provide and help foster short-term reactive coping mechanisms. But now we're moving far beyond just simply water trucking and establishing water tanks and tap stands and distributing jerry cans to actually engaging in urban services. And this speaks somewhat to the social cohesion, although very difficult to measure. There are definitely cases where we see that social compact between a service provider at a local level and the population can be strengthened by purely the quantity and quality of the service, moving from an intermittent to poor quality service to a more reliable service is one example. I think a nuance there is that often in humanitarian settings, the concern can be that you're then attaching yourself to one side of the conflict, being a local actor linked to, for instance, a government. This is where humanitarian principles play a critical role, and what we see today, especially in non-international armed conflicts, which makes up most of these conflicts that we're involved in today, is that it provides opportunities across lines to open up opportunities for humanitarian access and to ensure coverage of service provision in both opposition-held areas and government-held areas. Additionally, there's an increasing sophistication of armed groups these days to recognize that controlling territory also means being able to provide services. And so these open up opportunities to work cross lines and develop potentials for negotiating not only humanitarian access, but the interdependencies that exist between various resources open up the opportunity for conflict, not only conflict management, but conflict resolution at a local level. More robust responses that factor in both the root causes and humanitarian consequences provide a contribution to alleviating local tensions, avoiding certain grievances, and possibly playing into edging closer towards a transition for peace. And I think definitely the work on urban services is one of those areas that is slowly moving us towards that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting elements adding up together. I think we'll move on to Murray, please.
So, picking up some of the themes that Michael's just mentioned, I'll add from the refugee perspective. In the previous round, I talked about some of the challenges that we face in refugee situations, conflict causing refugees, and refugees and host community having conflict. So the easiest solution to all of these things is to find a durable and long-lasting solution for refugees. And UNHCR normally looks at 3 areas. One would be return to the home country, so resolving the conflict, and so refugees can go back to where they came from. And we've seen this happen in many parts of the world over the last years. The second option that we have is what we call third country resettlement, where we can move refugees from an immediate hosting country to a third country, which then can reduce this refugee host conflict, host community conflict, but maybe then creates other refugee host community conflicts in the third country. And in fact, that actually gets a lot of media attention, but refugee resettlement is actually only a tiny little part of resolving refugee situations. And what UNHCR has found over recent years is that more and more refugee situations are becoming long and protracted. And this is where integration, or integrating refugees more fully into the host communities where they are, becomes more important, and something that UNHCR has focused on a lot in recent years, and increasingly so. And as we now move into the age of sustainable development goals, and the fact that many of the SDGs talk about universal coverage, access for all, and I focus particularly on the water sanitation goal 6, which is sustainable access to water and sanitation for all, it means that all within your borders, including refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless people, are now the responsibility of governments or those countries to include in their sustainable development goal targets, so that by 2030, all people within the world can have access to safe water and sanitation, or whatever the other 17 goals are there. And what we've found is that conflict-affected and fragile states are the ones that are lagging behind in the sustainable development goal progress. And people, I don't want to be a bringer of doom, but people somehow believe in their mind that peace is the normal state of reality and conflict is the abnormal. But what I see in many parts of the world, conflict is actually the normal reality and peace is the abnormal. So learning how to work within conflict-affected areas, within fragile states, within these border regions that are often where refugees are, is a new way of thinking. And we've heard some of the ideas from Michael around what ICRC is doing. But in terms of what UNHCR is doing, we're looking at issues of harmonizing service levels between refugees and hosting communities to avoid this level of conflict at the ground level, so that we can be providing refugees with the same level of service provision as local people would be receiving in that area. We're looking at how to integrate refugee wash service provision, water and sanitation service provision within national systems, and integrate planning for refugees within national development planning. And where you have a situation where refugees are in a country for 20 years, 25 years, 40 years, this is a normal development cycle, and refugees can be incorporated into that. Funding can come from normal development mechanisms. And the final factor is, if refugees can be given the right to work, which is part of the 1951 Convention, as a hosting country you should give refugees the right to work, and freedom of movement, then they can become an economic contributor towards the economy. They can be paying for the services in the same way as normal people or citizens do. And so one thing UNHCR is very much trying to do, working with ILO, working with others, is to change the mindset of hosting countries to see refugees as actually a contributor towards sustainable development and a net contributor towards economic growth, and not to be seen as a burden to a country, but actually people that can bring positive net reality. And we often wear this t-shirt that says Einstein was a refugee, to trying to blow this concept that refugees are going to be a heavy burden on a country, but can actually bring a lot of positive with them. And I think that if we change the way that we think about refugees, change the way that we think about service provision in some of these fragile states, that we can actually see these areas growing towards the sustainable development goals and achieving reduced conflict in some of these areas. So thanks.
So we've moved from water management to seed systems, to urban resource management in conflict areas, to the SDGs linked to refugees. Good luck.
All right, thanks very much. First of all, I think I'd just like to build off a point that Murray was saying at the end there, and I think we really should recognize Uganda and Uganda's role in taking in predominantly South Sudanese refugees and affording them the right to work, the right to movement, and even giving them a 30 by 30 square meter, 30 meters by 30 meters, so 900 square meter parcel of land on which to grow food and otherwise. Now, not saying it's perfect, but given we're talking about 1.2 million refugees, that is quite a significant open door policy by anybody's, any stretch of the imagination. Just to mention another thing linking to the SDGs and about leaving no one behind. The report that came out earlier this autumn, The State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World, which is co-authored by FAO, WFP, UNICEF, and WHO, is clearly points to the fact that if we don't resolve conflict, and conflict is the major impact on food security, we will not achieve SDG 2 by 2030. We're seeing a slight uptick in the amount of severely food insecure in the world to 815 million now, up from 777 million last year. And we know that in protracted crises and in conflicts, people are 2.5 times to 3 times more food insecure than they are in other development situations. So we have some real challenges looking ahead over to 2030. So to come back a little bit to, and we've been at various different levels in some of the interventions, from the kind of water cooperation at a very macro level, if you like, intergovernmental. I think I'll focus a little bit on a couple of examples of work that I've been involved in around local level natural resource management and some of the approaches that we've taken that have been successful. But also then hopefully we can start thinking about some of the issues around that as well. Part of which is, and I'm going to flag some of the challenges maybe up front. One is about the problem of scaling up and how easy it is or not to do that, and the fact that you also still need to be very context specific. And I think another large challenge, one which I didn't mention in the first session, is these things take time. You need time on the ground, and so often we are not in a position with a project cycle or programming cycles to have that longer term engagement with communities, which is required. Because I think a couple of the things which really came out of everybody's interventions, a key one is trust. Trust is absolutely essential, no matter where it is, but how you build trust, and building trust takes time. And linked to that, an example I'd just like to speak to is in the Abyei administrative area, which is a contested box between Sudan and South Sudan, which wasn't resolved in the CPA and hasn't yet been, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, and hasn't yet been, the border hasn't been defined between Sudan and South Sudanese governments. There is a stabilization force there which provides security, which is a UN mission, and there are two tribes, the Miseria and the Dinka and Ngok, who both are pastoralists, who use that area for pasture land for grazing for their cattle. And over the years, it is a deteriorated situation where previously they had an accord between tribal leaders and tribal communities over the use of this land, but that has become complicated by external factors, by the situation in Sudan over the years, by the South Sudanese independence, and by this sort of hanging situation that they find themselves in as well, with very little administration or a dysfunctional administrative, joint administrative body set up. So working with them was through a vaccination campaign, a livestock vaccination campaign, which started by training community-based animal health workers, Miseria, to then inoculate, to vaccinate Dinka and Ngok cattle, and vice versa. So we were starting a movement of people across lines which basically they hadn't been able to do before. That then led to the development of a simple but community-based peace agreement, which then allowed for a certain understanding about compensation, restitution, about movement of cattle. So the point here is that the natural resource, grazing, pasture land, were able to address that through going through a different angle and finding a window of opportunity within which you could then have a more substantive discussion. And if you're interested, in the Palais des Nations at entrance 40, there is a small photo exhibition, which is not in the Geneva Peace Week brochure, but we shipped it up from Rome, and it's been put up by my colleagues here. So that tells you the whole story of this through 22 very, very good photos taken by our guy who was 2 years in a container in Abyei and also happened to be an excellent photographer. So as well as an excellent project, he's also managed to do the communication side. So it's worth going to have a look at because it's an interesting story. One which links to refugees and host communities, and a key natural resource which you mentioned is over wood fuel, which could be, or is over wood I should say, which could be for building, but more often than not it's over fuel for cooking or heating. It's the traditional biomass. Now approaches and an interagency initiative is safe access to fuel and energy. And working with UNHCR, with UNEP, WFP, others, in various settings, be it Kakuma or camps elsewhere in Ethiopia and Sudan, you can find solutions which help address the real problems associated with wood fuel collection, environmental degradation, real issues over which are gender-related to exposure to sexual exploitation, rape. It's got nutritional aspects, as well as food security and so forth. So some of the ways that you can address that are by putting out community woodlots, which may be managed by either the host community or the displaced population. That can set up an economic interaction between the communities and making sure that's done on an equitable basis. Or sustainable charcoal production, for example. Providing solutions and technical solutions which help address the issue over competition of a particular natural resource. Another very quick example I'm going to use my 10 seconds I didn't use last time, is on pastoralist field schools. Again, cross-border pastoralist communities in Kenya and Uganda, where it's been a hot spot for intertribal conflicts for a number of years. And by bringing them together into pastoralist field schools where they can have an engagement over a learning environment where they can exchange information, best practices, learn about grassroots way of coping with drought risks, for example, or related challenges, and using that as an entry point to address maybe some issues which have been not addressed in the past. Now, it's not to say that it resolves cattle raiding between the Karamojong or the Pokot tribes, but it does provide an entry point where people can start engaging with each other and slowly maybe building trust. And I think I'll end on the word trust because I think it is central to everything that we've been saying. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. Now the challenge is yours to find questions to continue this extremely interesting discussion that I feel could go way beyond the 15 minutes that we have. But for all our sakes, I think we'll try and stick to the 15 minutes. So please a raise of hands as to who would like to comments, questions. And again, I'll collect a few and then we'll go back to the panel in about 10 minutes to have some quick answers. You can pick and choose.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentations. This question, I guess, is very specifically, what do you think of the role of states in this kind of unfolding reality? But I'm with the University of Geneva. My name is Joshua Green. I look at water markets and specifically access to water. And I think something Michael said strikes a chord, that we're actually seeing new inequalities in terms of access to water. And I'm struck by two things. One, the new joint monitoring, joint JMP report by SDGs says that 73% of Mexicans receive their drinking water through bottled water. And they've kind of redefined what access means. So they say from now on we're going to count packaged water as a form of access. And the new blended finance report says that in order to meet the SDGs, we really need to make risk returns positive for investors, because we expect otherwise we won't have the investments into these sectors. So are we really talking about a withdrawal of the state and kind of a new world where this access is provided by multinational corporations? And I guess my question is, what do you think of the role of states in terms of trying to mitigate this or provide access to this? In many cases, I think we find the states are actually the enablers of this new paradigm.
Seeing as we've got state representatives in the room, feel free to also answer that question.
Thank you. I haven't heard anybody talking about 80% of wastewater that is untreated today, and that could be a good way of not only alleviating poverty, because everybody's got wastewater. I remind that the value of wastewater is higher than the value of water in certain cases. So the interaction between the trading that is taking a lot of water for the moment via the trading of all the commodities that are on commodities exchanges, because I like the intervention of Nora, but you tackle just a tiny drop in comparison with the virtual water that is traded, for example, via soya or sugar or chicken from Brazil to other places. So we need to go to a higher level, because we are in front of an emergency. So I respect your work, but do you work also with the commodities exchanges, with the banks that are through whom all the transit of the water is going?
Thank you. And just to say that Nora's work is focusing on seed systems, and it's a burgeoning research element, just to...
Thank you. Just a quick comment on the question of trust and finding solutions. The tendency usually is always we go and fix the problem there. There is conflict, there is tension, and we know we have tools, we have best practices, and we are going to fix it. And most of the cases, the communities themselves, they have the solution. They know the solutions. They know how to fix it. It's just they don't have probably the tools or the resources that they are able to do it. And that, I think, when the community themselves come with the ideas of solution, that's what helps build the trust in the best way.
Thank you very much. Our colleague from Romania has a question, and then we'll have one in the back.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the second round of presentation. Only short comments linked to the presentation of Mara. I want to bring your attention about other positive example for cooperation in transformative way. under International Commission for Pollution, Control Pollution of Danube River, ICPDR, which will organize by the end of this month, 29th and 30th of November in Bucharest, the capital of my country, one of the parties to the ICPDR, a first workshop on management, international management of wastewater problems, focus on a linkage on the wastewater management and SDGs, being focus on investment in financing, partnership to settle these problems, and I kindly invite you, if you are interested, to enter on the link on the website of this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had a question from the gentleman there in the spectacles. Yes. And then the last two, and then we can all have dinner.
So my question somehow relates to some points that were raised. Oh, sorry, I'm Paulo. I'm from the Graduate Institute. I also used to work at the Brazilian National Congress. And in this process, I had the opportunity to work with some projects that relate to some points that were raised about water market and sanitation. And I'm also researching them right now. And I would like to have your input on those. What happens in São Paulo is that there are regions under conflict that the state company couldn't go before because it's controlled by gangs, but then approached a private company who had contacts with women in these communities. And these women are actually working to engage the community in joining the water system and the sewage system. This all works very fine in general, but there are points that the gangs are not willing to give up their control over water access. And in these cases, the state doesn't have either the will or the power to impose on those gangs, because the cost would be so high, both in terms of human lives and money. But on the other hand, the communities do not have the power to overthrow those gangs either. So how do you approach that in democratic states from the conflict point of view to make this access viable? Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for convening this important meeting. I'm Riyad from the State of Palestine Mission. I have an additional comment on water, conflict, and peace. In the Middle East region, especially in my country, Palestine, water rights is one of the most complex and tricky elements of negotiations. For this reason, water remain or kept to be dealt with the final status of the negotiation of the peace process. And as all of you know, till now, this discussion on water were never conducted since 1967. 80% of our natural resources, water of the West Bank, is used by the illegal Israeli settlements. Finally, I think we are very far away from achieving SDG number 6, water, because there is no trust and time is running, and we are in a need for a political goodwill, for peace and water. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll bring it back to the panel now to answer some of those questions. A lot of them seem to be about water. So I think I'll let those who can speak to that best go first. Mara, and then any of the panelists, please do intervene if you would like to. Yeah? Okay, we'll state. Did you want to?
I understood that in water conflicts we have in mind the role of multinational companies. So I have now I can mention the example in Bolivia. Maybe the Cochabamba conflict between multinational corporation and the state. I think that in a few weeks there will be here in Geneva the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights. So it is really a very interesting moment to consider this issue. And from the legal point of view, I would like to mention the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that have been adopted by the Human Rights Council and are considered really as an instrument of reference for the obligation, also responsibilities of corporations. And in this moment also there are the negotiations of a binding agreement on multinational corporations. I would like to say that so the conflict on water, land and food can also have a component related to private companies and the relationship between private companies and states. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll go this way around this time and then we'll have a wrap up with Julius.
There was one particular question that was addressed towards me. The mention of both migration issues as well as gang violence is often, by the ICRC anyway, characterized as other situations of violence. Typically those that we see in much of Latin America is dealt with in a very reactive humanitarian way. Primarily it's an issue of legitimacy and access in terms of different humanitarian actors on the ground. Whereas in conflict settings, we're seeing a very different trend moving not away from, but complementing traditional humanitarian responses. So access to bottled water, meeting immediate life-saving needs, but complementing that then with a more medium to long-term, more structured support, which is this engagement with service providers in contexts where it's warranted. And so the aim there is to move as quickly as possible from substitution, those traditional responses, to support, and really enabling service providers at the local level to be able to carry out solutions that they see fit to provide water resources to the general public to ensure access, but also then leveraging our humanitarian principles to be able to try to ensure that that coverage area extends beyond just either government-held areas to opposition-held areas or vice versa. And so when we look at, for instance, the sphere standards in these longer-term protracted conflicts, looking at issues around not necessarily refugees, but IDPs and host communities, we are also trying to ensure the same level of access, but one that is linked to then historical use in those countries.
Thank you very much. Nora?
I just wanted to quickly say, if you did, so this is still ongoing research and it's focusing on seed systems, but if you had any comments, I'm happy to, if you wanted to speak afterwards. And just quickly to the lady in the back, I think that was part of this sort of research initially to focus on the positive, on what is already working and just learning from that. And as you said, the communities have the solutions to build on those functioning systems. Just wanted to reiterate that.
Maybe just a few comments to complement what Michael said, particularly on these questions of the role of state in provision of services, and also perhaps relates to this example from Sao Paulo of the gangs. I think one thing that we're learning as a community in this industry is that the way that we deal with service provision in conflict-affected and fragile states, and maybe even you could say conflict-affected communities, needs to be a paradigm shift from the way that we've thought in the past. And I think that people have had an assumption that large-scale centralized systems of water provision, sewage and sanitation, and we could extend this to irrigation and so on, is the solution. And once you get that, then somehow you're developed and you meet SDG goals. But I think the reality is that what we're observing more and more is that large-scale centralized systems bring their own set of problems. So in a military or conflict-affected area, it's an easy target to impact a large number of people. It's also an easy system to control and give someone or an individual group a large amount of power. And what I've observed is in these types of situations, smaller scale decentralized systems are often preferred. So for example, in Lebanon, which has gone through many different conflicts and unstable governments and so on, we worked on a project with a centralized system. We brought water pipes to the ground floor of apartments, and they said, sorry, we don't want to be connected to your water, even though it costs $1 per cubic meter. We want to continue paying $5 per cubic meter for our water truck that we know will continue to deliver water during air raids, during unstable governments, and we will have a continuous supply, and we're prepared to pay more for it. And this is where I think the concept of different ways of providing supply, whether it's, I wouldn't necessarily say small-scale bottled water, but often these 20-liter bottled water systems, small kiosks, treatment plants, and so on, can actually be a viable solution in certain situations, and maybe better than a centralized system. But it's not a one-size-fits-all, that's for sure. Thanks.
And then we'll also challenge him to wrap up the discussion. So.
I think it was terribly unfair because I think my fellow panelists have done an excellent job of responding to the various comments and questions in that last round. So it's a very easy job. But just maybe a couple of comments to complement what's already been said. I think the point Murray just raised around decentralized systems and thinking about what we may need, particularly when you think about recovery or post-conflict situations. And it puts me in mind of the situation in Syria. Now, we don't know what the accommodation is going to look like, but what we do know is that you had very unsustainable water extraction prior to the conflict, that you had a very centralized economic structure, particularly the food system. So what will the food system look like, or should look like, in the future? And we need to really take on board then, is it going to be an irrigated system? Is rain-fed wheat production still going to be viable given climate change, given drought which took place in the years prior to civil war? So I think we do need to be much more innovative in our thinking about this, and to start thinking about this now and a year or 2 years ago, rather than in a year or 2 or 3 years' time when we have some kind of an accommodation and we have a reconstruction effort. So it's like, instead of D+1, it should be D-1. So yeah, I think that paradigm shift is very important. And that links to maybe a couple of other points. One about, we are starting to see it, I think, with support from the international community, but also recognition by governments themselves, that you do need to invest over time. And that's partly linked to the famous humanitarian development peace nexus continuum discussion. But it's also a recognition that you are not going to be getting results necessarily in your preferred electoral cycle, that it may not be 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, that it will take longer than that. And I think we are starting to see some positive shifts in that regard. On a couple of the specific points, around hidden water, I think is the term that's used, the commodity exchanges question, which somebody raised. 70% of water used in the world is used for agriculture. And that, as raised by our colleague from Palestine, has a huge impact then on your ability, if you don't have access to water, to produce food, to farm, and for your food system as a whole. Whether or not, I mean, in terms of how the commodity exchanges deal with that, I think this is something which is emerging as a question. And it's something which may need to be factored into commodity prices in time, but it's not an area where I can say specifically what's happening there. So overall, I think we had a really interesting discussion and a very rich one, and I think very complementary across the different agencies. I don't know if you want to make some final remarks, Florence, but
throwing back
thanks
all
very
at
much.
Me. Thank you very much for everybody for participating, and especially at this late hour. I think we've covered a lot of ground in an hour and a half. And as I said, I do invite you to email, phone, contact, meet the various panelists that are both in Geneva, Zurich, and Rome. And just continue the discussions outside of the room or after the session right now. So thank you very much for coming, and yes, please do stay in touch if this topic is interesting to you. Thank you.